They gave her everything: tuition, applause, a seat at the table. They gave me silence. And silence became my second language. While she was flying first class to campus, I was refilling coffee cups between lectures. While they framed her achievements on the living room wall, they barely asked what I was studying. But I wasn't angry. I was watching. I was building not with privilege, but with purpose. And on graduation day, when the auditorium fell silent, it wasn't because I failed to become someone. It was because I became someone they never expected. My name is Emily. I don't remember the exact words echoing through the speaker system. Everything felt muted, like my heartbeat had swallowed the sound. Just the steady rhythm of my footsteps across the wooden stage, one after another, toward the podium. They had just called my name, valedictorian, the commencement speaker. Applause rippled slowly across the crowd, first hesitant, then fuller, louder. Someone whistled. Someone else called my name, their voice cracking with emotion. But I kept my eyes fixed on one row third from the front. There my father sat with his arms crossed. My mother held her purse tightly, her eyes scanning the rows of caps and gowns like she was still searching for a mistake. They didn't clap. They didn't smile. They didn't lean in and whisper proud things to each other like other parents did. They just sat there frozen, as if they weren't sure what they were witnessing. As if they still hoped someone would come up and say it had all been a mix-up. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't even angry. I just felt light. Because in that moment, I knew I didn't need their applause. I didn't need their validation. Everything I had built was here beneath my feet, echoing in every step, every silent night that led to this one. I stood tall. I looked at them. Then I looked past them at the people I had served. The elderly women and men who'd pressed buttons on a screen I had coded by hand. People who had lived alone and felt seen for the first time. People whose lives in small ways had changed. Not because of my family, but because I had decided to show up for myself. I began my speech. I wasn't nervous. I didn't ramble. I didn't explain or justify. I spoke of gratitude, a quiet, complex kind of gratitude. I spoke of learning to hear myself through the silence. I spoke of building something at 2 a.m., after a closing shift of choosing purpose when praise wasn't offered. And when I finished, the room erupted. Strangers stood, some cried. Some. A classmate raised a thumbs up from halfway across the auditorium. One of my professors nodded again and again, like he had been waiting for someone else to finally see what he always did. I looked back at the third row. My father had bowed his head. My mother's eyes were glassy, but she said nothing. She didn't need to, because everything had already been said. That graduation wasn't a victory. It was a closing chapter. The final line of a book I had written in the margins in between missed holidays, secondhand laptops, and self-doubt. And now it was done. After the ceremony, I didn't approach them. They didn't call my name. I walked down the side steps, my gown still flowing, my cap still pinned tight. Outside, the sun was relentless brilliant. And I knew my real world was just beginning. They always said her name first. In every conversation, every family gathering, every Christmas card, my sister's name rolled off their tongues like the obvious beginning to any story. She's in law school now, they would beam. At one of the top programs, she's going to do great things. Then almost as an afterthought, they'd turn to me and say, and this is our younger daughter. She's into computers or something. I learned early that there was a hierarchy of dreams in our home. Law was prestige, medicine was pride, tech was just screens and keyboards and long nights in dark rooms. Not something a girl should invest her future in, at least not one of their girls. When my sister said she wanted to be a lawyer, my parents bought her the newest MacBook and framed a photo of her at the courthouse shadowing a family friend. When I said I wanted to study computer science, my mom scoffed. Staring at a screen all day, who's going to hire you for that? She wasn't being cruel. She genuinely didn't understand. I didn't push back. I had stopped pushing back years ago. My sister had her own room with a proper desk, natural light, and shelves lined with hardcover textbooks. I had a corner of the dining table and a clunky hand-me-down laptop I bought from a pawn shop. She got driven to internships and picked up after mock trials. I figured out public transit and learned to eat meals on the go. She had a cheering section. I had a checklist. They paid for everything for her tuition books, apartment plane tickets home during breaks. They said she needed to focus. I was told to apply for work study, maybe get a job at a café. It'll build character, my dad said once. Make you tougher. Tougher than what exactly? Sometimes I would walk past my parents' bedroom and hear them on speakerphone with my sister, laughing, asking about her classes, telling her how proud they were. I listened from the hallway. They rarely asked me those questions. When they did, it felt like a formality, not interest. But I didn't cry. I didn't sulk. I didn't raise my voice. I just remembered. I remembered everything. The birthdays they forgot when hers landed on the same week. The talent show they missed because her debate club had regionals. The time I got an A in calculus and my mom said, "Well, you've always been good with numbers," and then changed the subject. There's a unique kind of silence in being the child they forget to introduce properly. It doesn't echo. It settles. You start to shrink not because you feel small, but because no one ever asks you to stand tall. You start doing things not for applause, but to see if they matter without it. You live like a backup file, necessary, functional, but never the one opened first. And yet in that space, something grew. Not resentment, not rage, just resolve. I decided I wouldn't prove them wrong. That was never the goal. I would prove myself right. I would chase a purpose they couldn't recognize. I would build something real, even if they never clapped, never called, never noticed. It started as code in the middle of the night. A string of lines I wrote after closing shift at the café. My roommate was asleep. The dorm was quiet. No one saw me typing. No one asked why I looked tired the next day. And that was fine, because when no one is watching, you stop performing. You start becoming. I didn't need their spotlight. I didn't want it. I needed room to build my own. And eventually I would. But before all that, before the applause, I didn't expect the platform. I didn't ask for the silence on stage. I was simply the second child, the one they forgot to see. In every photo album on our living room shelf, she's in the center, wearing a crown at her 5th grade spelling bee, holding a bouquet at her dance recital, smiling in a crisp blazer outside the courthouse during her summer internship. And always just out of frame or half-cropped at the edge was me. There was no deliberate malice in the way our parents favored her. It wasn't theatrical. It was subtle, like the way sunlight naturally leans toward taller trees. She just happened to be the child that aligned with their vision of pride, poised, articulate, photogenic. Her wins were obvious and measurable. Mine were quiet, often invisible, and far less understood. Dinner conversations revolved around her classes, her professors, her brilliant insights in seminars. When I tried to bring up something I was learning in a Python course or a side project I was working on, it landed with a polite nod, followed by a swift return to discussing her moot court victories. She had the advantage of being easy to explain. A law student at a top university, clean, respectable, familiar. I was studying computer science. To my parents, that meant spending hours alone in front of a screen doing something. They didn't understand it. Worse, they didn't try. And when people don't understand your path, they don't know how to root for you. When she graduated high school, they threw a party with catered food, a banner, and a slideshow. When I graduated, we went out for dinner. No decorations, no speeches. Just polite smiles and a comment from my dad that I should consider doing something stable like accounting. Every milestone in her life felt like a family affair. Every milestone in mine felt like a solo mission. She received a brand new laptop every year with all the latest specs, my parents called it, an investment in her future. I used a secondhand Dell I bought with wages from my weekend cafe job, one with a fan so loud it sounded like an airplane taking off. She had a tutor for standardized test guidance counselors who wrote glowing recommendations and family friends who opened doors. I filled out FAFSA forms alone, applied for scholarships through forums. and Googled how to write a good personal statement at 2 a.m. in the dark. When she got accepted into her dream law school, my mom cried. She framed the acceptance letter. She sent it to the family group chat with a dozen heart emojis. When I told them I got into my first choice university for computer science, there was a pause. "That's great," my dad said. "But are you sure that's a good fit for you?" It wasn't said with cruelty. That was the part that stung most. It was just doubt. Quiet, persistent doubt that seemed to follow me everywhere. Doubt I had learned to absorb, then silence. I didn't retaliate. I didn't roll my eyes or slam doors. I just observed, took mental notes, remembered. Over time, I stopped expecting them to clap for me. I stopped waiting for the proud looks, the unsolicited praise, the "we knew you could do it" moments. They didn't come, but something else did. A resolve. A slow, steady voice that whispered, "Do it anyway." I began treating my work like it mattered even when no one saw it. I stayed up past midnight, watching tutorials, debugging broken code, teaching myself new languages because no one else was going to teach me. I found joy in figuring out things the hard way, pride in solving problems no one else even knew existed. She had the spotlight, but I had something she didn't silence. And in that silence, I discovered focus. While she was getting flown to academic conferences, I was sketching wireframes on napkins during shift breaks. While she spoke on panels, I was building back-end systems for projects I wasn't sure anyone would use. But I was building. Every line of code was a brick in a foundation I hoped would matter, not to them, not to classmates or professors, but to someone out there who needed it. Someone overlooked like me. Someone who couldn't afford to wait for applause. They called her brilliant. They called me quiet. But I knew brilliance didn't always shine loud. Sometimes it hums softly in the corner of a crowded room, biding its time. Watching, building, becoming. My acceptance letter came on a Wednesday afternoon. I was alone in the kitchen reheating leftovers. The subject line was simple: "Congratulations." I opened the email slowly, half expecting a rejection. When I saw the offer from the computer science department, I didn't scream or jump. I just exhaled, quiet and steady. This was supposed to be the moment, the one where everything turned, the one where I called my parents and they finally saw what I was building. Instead, my mother stared at the email on my phone and asked, "So you'll be studying computers?" I nodded. She didn't smile. She just offered a half shrug and said, "Well, if that's what you really want." I still think something more traditional would be better. More traditional. Like law or medicine or accounting. Something with clear outcomes, salaries, titles to brag about. My sister's path had lanes paved by others. Mine was still a construction zone full of potholes and second guesses. My father didn't say much either. Just a quiet congrats, followed by a long silence. "Then you'll have to work really hard, you know. That field is tough, especially for women. Especially for women." I had heard that before from teachers, from counselors, from YouTube comments on Tech Talks. It wasn't new, but hearing it from him, my own father, made it feel heavier. Less like a warning and more like a prediction. They didn't ask what drew me to coding. They didn't ask about the tutoring site I'd built for local kids over the summer or the volunteer project where I helped digitize patient forms at a community clinic. They didn't see the vision. To them, I was just another girl staring at screens. Not someone with plans, just someone avoiding people. So I stopped sharing. I didn't tell them when I started prepping for my classes early, watching free lectures online, and building mini apps in my spare time. I didn't tell them when I created a GitHub account or when one of my scripts was forked by a stranger on the other side of the world. They didn't ask. I didn't offer. We drifted like that together in space, but on separate orbits. When move-in day came, they helped load the car. My mom folded clothes with military precision. My dad carried boxes. They didn't say they were proud. They didn't give a pep talk. At the dorm, they made small talk with my roommate's parents, shook hands, took a few photos. Then my mother looked around the room, nodded and said, "Well, you'll figure it out." I remember the moment they left. The door clicked shut. The hallway went quiet. I stood in the middle of that tiny room, surrounded by boxes and silence, and thought, this is it. This is where I begin. No one expected much from me. And that was freeing. I wasn't weighed down by their hopes. I wasn't forced to become anyone's image of success. I could fail quietly, learn without pressure, build in secret. And so I did. While my peers were joining clubs and rushing sororities, I was mapping out an idea that had been growing in the back of my mind for months. Something that merged tech with care, something that could help people who felt as alone as I often did. It started with a question. How do we take care of people no one checks in on? That single line became my obsession. I didn't know how to answer it yet, but I knew where to start. In between classes, I read about elder care models. I researched hospital communication systems. I studied the psychology of isolation. Every elective I chose, every paper I wrote every weekend I stayed in it, all pointed toward the same silent goal. And still my parents never asked what I was up to. They called occasionally, asked if I was eating, reminded me to lock the windows at night. But they didn't ask what I was building. They didn't ask what drove me, what kept me up at night. That was okay. Some dreams don't need witnesses in the beginning. They just need space. And silence I had plenty of. The dorm room was barely bigger than a storage unit. 2 twin beds, 2 desks, and just enough floor space to pivot from one to the other. My side was the one near the window, though the view wasn't much, just a brick wall and the edge of a vending machine. My roommate Jenna was studying biology. She had a long-distance boyfriend, a Pinterest board for her future apartment, and zero interest in anything I was doing. Which was fine. I wasn't here to make friends. I was here to build. My first night, I unpacked my laptop, the beat-up Dell I'd bought with tip money from the café back home. Its battery only held a charge for 30 minutes, so I kept it plugged in at all times. The fan rattled when I typed too fast, and there was a scratch across the screen that never went away, no matter how many times I wiped it. Still, it was mine. My first semester schedule was packed data structures intro to discrete math, a writing seminar, and an elective in healthcare systems I'd begged to swap into. Most of my classmates had come from magnet schools or coding camps. They already spoke the language. I was translating everything from scratch. I stayed quiet in lectures, took notes obsessively, went to office hours without asking questions, just to listen to what others were struggling with. At night, when Jenna was asleep and the hallway had gone still, I'd open my terminal and start practicing. Midnight became my magic hour. It was the only time the building truly slept. No doors slamming, no conversations outside my door, just the soft hum of the air conditioning and the glow of my screen. That's when I did my best thinking. Not just about classwork, but about something bigger, something that still didn't have a name. The idea had started back in high school after volunteering at a local clinic, where most of the patients were elderly. I remembered how so many of them came in alone, how they'd sit quietly in the waiting room, gripping their prescriptions, like they were the last connection they had to anyone. No one visited, no one called, and even then something inside me whispered, there has to be a better way. Now sitting cross-legged in a dorm room that smelled faintly of instant noodles and shared laundry, I started sketching out what that better way might look like. Not in polished terms, not a business model, just questions. What if there was an app? What if students could help bridge the gap? What if people didn't have to grow old and invisible? I created a folder on my desktop and called it Code for Care. It wasn't much, just a name. But for the first time since starting college, I felt like I had something that belonged entirely to me. During the day, I went through the motions, attended labs, submitted assignments, nodded along to lectures. But every night, the real work began. I taught myself how to build user interfaces, learned to connect databases, read forum posts deep into the early morning hours, written by developers halfway across the world. I watched videos on accessibility in tech, on digital literacy for seniors, on secure messaging protocols. Sometimes I'd glance at Jenna's side of the room where her books lay untouched, while she FaceTimed her boyfriend. And I'd wonder what it would feel like to be normal, to spend an evening watching shows, gossiping, dreaming about weekend plans. But I didn't want that, not really, because the silence I had, lonely as it sometimes felt, was also sacred. It was where I was becoming someone, and still my parents never asked what I was working on. They'd call occasionally, mostly out of routine, ask if I needed money, remind me to stay safe. But never once did they say, "Tell us what you're building." Never once did they ask what lights you up, so I stopped waiting for them to care. And I kept typing. Every function I wrote felt like a small rebellion against their doubt. Every new skill I picked up felt like proof, not that I belonged here, but that I could stay even when no one helped me hold on. By midterms, I had a rough prototype. It barely worked. The interface looked like it was built in 2005. But it had structure, logic, potential. I didn't show it to anyone. Not yet. Because this wasn't about validation. It was about endurance. By the end of my first semester, I had 2 things: a half-functioning prototype and a job at a 24-hour campus café. I didn't apply because I wanted to. I applied because I had to. My scholarship covered tuition, but not much else. Book supplies, laundry, the occasional meal outside the dining hall, all of that added up. Fast. The cafe was small, tucked beneath the student center with a flickering neon sign that buzzed whenever it rained. I worked the night shift from 8:00 p.m. to 2:00 a.m., mostly serving coffee to exhausted grad students and undergrads pulling all-nighters. The floor always smelled like burnt espresso and spilled sugar. No one noticed me there either. I wore a name tag, smiled on cue, memorized orders, got good at pretending I didn't hear professors talking down to their TAs or students flirting like they were the only 2 people awake in the world. I learned how to move quietly, efficiently, invisibly. And when the last customer left and the doors locked behind them, I'd pull out my laptop. I worked at a corner table near the mop sink, charging the computer from a worn-out outlet that sparked once when I bumped it with my knee. That became my second office, my hidden workspace. While the espresso machine cooled down, I built logic flows. While the floors dried, I sketched new UI ideas on napkins. I wasn't writing code to impress a professor or submit to a class. I was building something real. And even in that cramped, sticky cafe corner, I felt more alive than I did in any classroom. Some nights I'd glance at my reflection in the coffee pot. Tired eyes, grease-stained apron hair, tied back in a loose bun. This wasn't the version of me anyone would have bet on. Not my parents. Not even me if I was being honest. But somehow it felt right. There's a certain power in building when no one is watching. A freedom. You're not worried about failing publicly because no one knows what you're doing in the first place. Every bug you fix, every new feature that works, it's yours. Quiet victories in a world full of noise. By spring break, Code for Care had its first live page. It didn't look like much. A login screen, a dashboard, a tab for scheduling. But it worked. I clicked through the flow again and again, watching as it responded. It was like watching a flower open pixel by pixel. Still, I told no one. Not my professors. Not my classmates. Definitely not my parents. They didn't know I was working at the cafe either. I never mentioned it. What was the point? They would have told me to quit. Said it was too much, too risky, too hard. But risk was all I had, and somehow it didn't scare me. One night after my shift, I walked out into the freezing air and saw the campus covered in snow. Pure white, untouched. I stopped under a street lamp and looked around. No one else in sight. My breath clouded the air, and for a second I felt it. Like maybe I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not at the top of a class, not in some award ceremony, just here, awake, working. Quietly changing the world one line of code at a time. I went back to the dorm, too wired to sleep. Jenna was out of town for the weekend, so I had the room to myself. I opened my laptop, launched the app, and stared at the login page. I created a test account, Logged in. Everything held. I built a mock profile, scheduled a test visit, sent a dummy alert. Each function triggered exactly how I'd written it. There it was, my idea breathing on its own. And for the first time in months, I let myself smile. Not because it was finished, but because I had started. It started with a question I couldn't stop asking: who checks on the people no one checks on? Not a rhetorical question, a real one. One that kept resurfacing during lectures at work, in the quiet spaces between emails and midterms. I'd see someone at the bus stop, an elderly man trying to steady a paper bag on his walker, and wonder who helps him remember his meds. Who knows if he's eaten today? Who notices if he disappears? The idea behind Code for Care had been growing inside me for months, but this question made it urgent. It gave the code weight, purpose. I started researching not just healthcare, but the human infrastructure behind it: aging populations, understaffed clinics, adult children living hundreds of miles away. I read stories about seniors who passed away and weren't found for days. I read about rural hospitals stretched thin, about volunteer groups trying to fill impossible gaps. And I kept thinking, there has to be a way to connect the dots. There has to be a way to make it easier to care. The answer wasn't just technology, it was empathy through technology. Tools designed not for efficiency alone, but for dignity, connection, continuity, something that gave older adults the ability to feel seen, even from afar. So I went back to Code for Care. I rebuilt the framework. The login became more secure, the user interface simpler. I added a feature that allowed family members or volunteers to check and virtually confirm visits, schedule reminders. I wasn't sure exactly what I was building yet, but I knew what I wanted it to feel like. A lifeline. I reached out to one of my old high school teachers, Mr. Dalton, who volunteered part-time at a local senior center. I asked if he'd let me test the prototype with a few residents. He said yes. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in a rec room that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and bingo markers, holding a tablet I'd borrowed from the campus tech library. The first person to use Code for Care was a woman named Evelyn, 78, sharp-witted, lived alone, wore a red scarf like it was armor. I showed her how to use the app. She tapped the screen, skeptical, scrolled slowly, frowned, then laughed. "This little box tells me when to take my meds," she said. Well, about time someone did. We spent 45 minutes together. She didn't need help with the technology, she needed help believing anyone thought she was worth designing for. After that session, I cried in the bathroom. Not because it failed, because it worked. Not just functionally, but emotionally. Evelyn said she felt less forgettable with the app. That stuck with me. That word, forgettable. I walked back to campus in the cold that day, feeling like I'd done something real for the first time in a long time. Not theoretical, not just another homework submission. Real? But then the doubt crept in. Who was I to be building something like this? I wasn't a doctor. I wasn't even a grad student, just a quiet undergrad with a borrowed laptop and a bleeding heart. What if it broke? What if I couldn't scale it? What if Evelyn was the only one who ever used it? That night I sat in the café during my shift and stared at the home screen of the app. I almost deleted the whole folder, but I didn't. Instead, I wrote this at the top of my notes: if one person feels less invisible because of what I made, it's enough. That became the guiding principle for everything that followed. Not scale, not profit, not glory, impact. One person at a time. And the first step, making the app work better for the people it was meant to serve. I began gathering feedback quietly, informally. Notes on font size, color contrast, button placement. I watched how seniors interacted with it, where they hesitated, where they smiled. I started rebuilding again, not from scratch, but from compassion. And in the back of my mind, always that question: who checks on the people no one checks on? With every answer I found, I wrote more code. Because maybe the real answer wasn't a name or a person. Maybe the answer was me. It was late, close to midnight, when I finally sent them the link. Not to the homepage, not to a mock-up or concept note. I sent them the real thing. The working prototype of Code for Care. Clean, functional, live. I had spent the previous week ironing out final bugs. The scheduling tool now synced with calendars. Notifications could be personalized. I'd even added a call me later button for seniors who just needed to talk. No appointment, no agenda. Just conversation. I attached a short message. Hey, I've been working on something. I'd love for you to take a look. I sent it to both of them, my mom and dad, through the family group chat because I wasn't sure they checked email often. I kept it simple, no pressure, no expectations. Then I waited. An hour passed. 2, nothing. I told myself it was late. Maybe they were asleep. Maybe they'd check it in the morning and send a thoughtful reply. Something like, wow, this looks amazing, or even a basic proud of you. But the morning came, and still nothing. At first I refreshed the thread every few minutes, then hourly. Then I stopped checking. Days passed, still no response, not even a thumbs up emoji. It wasn't the silence that hurt. I was used to that. What stung was the realization that even when I handed them something tangible, something real, something that worked, they still didn't care enough to click. I didn't want praise. I wanted acknowledgement. Just a second of their time. A flicker of interest. But apparently, that was still too much to ask. I told myself they were busy. I told myself maybe they didn't understand what the app was. Maybe the link didn't work on their phones. Maybe they meant to reply, but forgot. I told myself every version of the story except the one I feared most, that they saw it, and didn't think it was worth responding to. I didn't cry, I didn't spiral, I just shut down a little. That weekend I skipped dinner with my roommate's friends. I turned down a study group. I buried myself in more code, rewrote parts of the back end, built out the analytics tab, cleaned up the CSS, because building felt better than wondering. Every line of code was a distraction from the echo in that chat window. Eventually, I stopped expecting a reply. But I didn't stop building. If anything, I pushed harder. I reached out to a professor I admired, someone in the healthcare informatics department, asked if he'd be open to reviewing my project. I didn't say much in the email, just attached a brief overview and a link. He replied within 4 hours, said he was impressed, asked if I'd consider applying for an undergraduate research grant, invited me to present the concept to a few folks at a campus innovation lab. It was the first time someone in authority saw me for something other than a GPA or a resume line. And it meant everything. I still didn't tell my parents. At that point, it didn't feel like it mattered. They hadn't asked what I was up to. They hadn't followed up. I stopped sending updates, not out of anger, but acceptance. You can't force someone to care. And chasing their attention was energy I couldn't afford to waste. I redirected it. Into better code, into a sleeker interface, into a pitch deck that made even skeptical advisors nod. I learned how to speak about my project in terms. People understood scalability, community partnerships, potential integration with local clinics. I wasn't just writing code anymore. I was learning how to advocate for what I built, how to defend it, how to honor it. One afternoon, I got an email from a nonprofit in another state. They'd seen a tweet about the app. A med student I barely knew had posted a screenshot praising the platform for being simple, elegant, and rooted in care. The nonprofit wanted to test it at one of their community centers. They said, "We think it could save lives." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then without thinking, I copied it and pasted it into the family chat. No caption, no explanation, just those 5 words. "We think it could save lives." Still no reply, not even a seen check mark. It was a Sunday evening when my sister called. I hadn't heard from her in months. She opened with the usual small talk, asked how school was going, if I was still working those weird night shifts, and whether I was coming home for spring break. I gave short answers. My tone was polite but guarded. We'd never been close. She'd always belonged more to our parents than to me. Then she said, "Mom sent me something you made. That care code thing." My heart stopped for a beat. Code for care, I said, correcting her. Not angrily, just precisely. Right, she replied breezily. Yeah, it's cute. Like sweet that you're thinking about old people and all? Cute. That word sat heavy in my chest. Not because she meant harm, but because she didn't mean to see anything more. To her, it was just a hobby, a pet project. Not the hours I'd poured into it, or the system I'd designed to protect the vulnerable, or the quiet revolution I was trying to build from a campus cafe and a dorm room. Just cute. She kept talking, describing a new internship she'd landed at a legal firm downtown. They were impressed with her mock trial scores. She'd met someone who used to work in government. They told her she had presence. She might get to sit in on real depositions. I listened. Nodded even though she couldn't see me, made all the right noises. But inside, something dimmed. Not because she had good news she deserved it, but because even now with real traction, real users, real interest from institutions, they still didn't get it. Even she didn't. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. She'd always been the one people recognized instantly, the one whose accomplishments made sense on paper, the one who fit into LinkedIn profiles and glowing introductions. I was just the quiet one, still into tech, still tinkering. To her, Code for Care was a craft project. To me, it was survival mine and someone else's. She ended the call by telling me I should totally try to get it on the App Store or something. Said I could make a bit of side cash. As if that had ever been the point. When we hung up, I sat for a long time staring at the home screen of the app. The logo still flickered slightly when it loaded something I hadn't fixed yet, but it worked. It helped people. Was that not enough? That night, I got a message from Evelyn, the first user I'd ever walked through the interface with. She said her daughter had used the app to schedule a remote visit for her birthday. It's the first time she didn't forget in 3 years, she wrote. I stared at that message longer than I had listened to my sister's entire phone call. Because this meant something. The next morning, I presented Code for Care to a small group of faculty mentors at the campus innovation lab. My voice didn't shake. My slides were clean. I walked them through the pain points of elder care, the barriers of digital literacy, and the design solutions I'd implemented. When I finished, one of the professors said, "This is the most human-centered product we've seen this semester." They asked if I had thought about scale. I said yes. They asked what kind of support I needed. I didn't know how to answer that, because the only support I'd ever needed, truthfully, was someone to believe this mattered. And in that moment, it finally felt like someone did. Afterward, I went to the café for my shift. I made cappuccinos, wiped tables, and carried the quiet thrill of validation in my chest. Not from family, but from people who didn't owe me anything. People who saw the work for what it was, not an accessory to my degree, but the centerpiece of my purpose. On my break, I opened the family group chat again. The last message was still mine. They think it could save lives. Still unread, still unseen. I left it there, didn't follow up, didn't resend, didn't explain. Because maybe not everyone is meant to understand the road you take. Some people can't see beyond their own definition of success. Some only understand applause, not impact. Some never learn that the world doesn't change in courtrooms or conferences, but in the smallest gestures. A reminder, a visit, a call that arrives on time for once, and an app that makes it possible. It started with an email I almost didn't open. The subject line was vague follow-up tech presentation, and the sender wasn't anyone I recognized. I was halfway through my shift at the cafe, balancing a tray of scones, when my smartwatch buzzed. I glanced at the preview, expecting spam. But when I finally sat down during my break and read the full message, everything shifted. It was from a program coordinator at a small community hospital, located 30 minutes outside the city. She'd heard about Code for Care through the campus innovation lab. Someone on the review panel had passed along my pitch materials. She said their facility had been struggling to manage non-urgent check-ins for elderly patients, many of whom lacked reliable caregivers or family. Then she wrote, "Would you be open to piloting the app with us for a 6-week trial? We can offer access to staff volunteers and a small stipend for your time. I reread the sentence 5 times. Then I blinked, laughed quietly, stunned. This was real, not a classroom project, not a late-night fantasy, not another that's cute from someone who didn't understand. This was a hospital, a place where people went to live or die, a place that believed my code could help. The next day I sat in my advisor's office, trying to sound calm while explaining the request. She leaned back, crossed her arms, and said, "You need to say yes, then figure everything else out later." I did. I replied to the email that night, said yes. 3 days later, I was on a Zoom call with the hospital's staff liaison, a woman named Teresa with kind eyes and an impatient voice. She asked technical questions, wanted to know about data encryption, HIPAA compliance, and backup protocols. I didn't have all the answers, but I had enough. I had documentation, I had diagrams, I had sincerity. And that apparently was enough. We set a launch date 6 weeks from that meeting, which meant I had less than 2 months to take Code 4 Care from a scrappy prototype to something that could withstand real-world usage. I built a calendar, color-coded every task, UI redesign red, bug fixes blue, testing scenarios yellow, back-end security audits flashing orange. I still had classes, still had work, still had to pretend everything was normal when my roommate asked why I hadn't joined the floor dinner again. But inside, nothing was normal. Everything was burning, in the best way. During lectures, I sketched API improvements in the margins of my notebook. During my shifts, I served coffee while calculating how to improve user onboarding with fewer taps. At night, I dreamt of error messages, and I loved it. For the first time in my life, stress felt like proof I was doing something real, something that mattered. I recruited 2 friends from my coding class to help with QA. They didn't ask for credit, just pizza and access to the test server. We worked from library corners and campus basements. We built spreadsheets and broke things and rebuilt them again. One night, Evelyn texted me again. She asked if the new version would still include the chat with me later button. I told her it would, that I'd made sure it had a bigger font, that she was the reason it existed. She replied, "Thank you for not forgetting us." That night I didn't sleep. Not because I was sad, because I felt the weight of responsibility for her, for everyone like her. People who had spent years being overlooked, invisible. Now I had one chance to make them feel seen. As the hospital pilot approached, I stopped updating my parents entirely. Not out of spite, out of clarity. They weren't part of this journey, not really. They hadn't asked. They hadn't clicked. They hadn't shown up. And that was okay now, because others had. And more were coming. One night before the soft launch, I found myself back at the café alone, cleaning the espresso machine. My shift was almost over. My body ached. My eyes burned. But I felt alive. I had built something from scratch through silence, through doubt, through absence. And now a hospital had said yes, not because they were trying to be nice, but because they needed it, because people needed it. And that changed everything. The thing no one tells you about growth is how lonely it can be. Everyone talks about excitement, opportunity, next steps, but no one warns you how much of scaling happens in the dark, behind screens, in silence, with no map. After the hospital's pilot launch, everything moved faster. Too fast. Within the first week, Code 4 Care had over 120 active users, elderly patients, staff volunteers, and family members scattered across small towns I'd never heard of. People I didn't know were suddenly using something I built in a dorm room. And every click, every appointment request, every chat message, they all led back to me. I wasn't ready, but I didn't have time to say that. Bugs started showing up, little ones at first. Notifications that triggered twice. A form that didn't submit unless the browser was refreshed. Then a bigger one, the server slowed to a crawl, when more than 40 users logged in simultaneously. I panicked. Spent 2 nights trying to fix it alone, barely sleeping. Missed a quiz, skipped a class. My roommate asked if I was okay. I lied and said I had a cold. The truth was I was burning out, but I didn't know how to stop or who to ask. I didn't have a team. I had 2 classmates who helped when they could. I didn't have a budget, just a grant that barely covered hosting costs. I didn't even have moral support. I still hadn't heard from my parents, not about the launch, not about the hospital, not even about the message I sent weeks ago. They hadn't said a word, so I kept building. Because who else would I taught myself back-end load balancing, migrated to a new server at 3 a.m. one Sunday morning, while the dashboard blinked red. I started logging every user complaint, every crash report. I became my own help desk, and still, people kept coming. A second hospital reached out, then a nonprofit, a university health clinic, all of them curious, cautiously optimistic, all of them looking for a solution to the same problem, the quiet collapse of elder care. I wanted to celebrate, but I didn't. Because every win came with a new avalanche of problems, and I didn't know how to carry them all. I tried to delegate, reached out to a CS club on campus, asked for volunteers. Some signed up, fewer showed up. Most left after a week when they realized there were no prizes, no media coverage, no cool tech swag. All I had to offer was meaning. And meaning apparently wasn't enough. I stopped asking for help after that. I just worked. Morning, afternoon, night. Lecture, code, work, code. Eat if possible, code again. Some days I forgot what day it was. My hands ached from typing. My eyes hurt from blue light. My brain stopped registering anything except error logs and feature tickets. I snapped at Jenna for playing music too loud. She stopped talking to me after that. The worst part, I began to question whether it was worth it, whether I was chasing something noble or just masochistic. Because building something good shouldn't hurt this much, should it? Then one night I got a message, not from a hospital, not from a professor, from a 91-year-old user named Bernard. He said, "Just wanted you to know your app helped me remember my wife's birthday. She's been gone 5 years. I still like to light a candle." I stared at that message for a long time. Tears came, not dramatic, not cinematic, just slow and tired and real. Because in that moment, I remembered why I started. It wasn't about scale. It wasn't about being the next big thing. It was about Bernard and Evelyn and every forgotten person who needed to feel remembered. I saved his message in a folder I called Proof It Matters, and I kept going, not because I had to, but because no one else was doing it. And someone needed to. The email subject line read, "Keynote Inquiry, Spring Commencement." I thought it was a mistake. At first I assumed they meant to send it to someone else, maybe a grad student, a medal winner, someone with a perfect GPA and a last name that showed up often in university newsletters. Not me. But no, it was real. The message came from the dean's office. They'd reviewed a list of student leaders and nominees for graduation speakers. My name had come up twice. They wanted me to give the keynote address at commencement, valedictorian. I read the email 3 times before closing the laptop, backing away from the desk, like the screen had burned me. I wasn't sure how to process it. Not because I didn't want it, but because I wasn't sure I deserved it. I hadn't been student body president. I hadn't run a club. I hadn't mentored underclassmen or joined honor societies. I'd spent most of college hiding in code working nights, turning down invitations I couldn't afford to accept. But apparently, somewhere along the way, someone noticed. Someone had seen Code for Care, not just as an app, but as a legacy. I didn't tell my parents. Not yet. Not because I was being petty, but because by now the silence was the norm. The family group chat had become a scroll of blue check marks and unanswered links. It felt pointless to drop this in like breaking news, so I kept it to myself. Instead, I emailed the dean's office back. Said yes, then stared at the blinking cursor in a blank Google Doc for the next 4 nights. What do you say when you never expected to be heard? What do you say when you've built everything in silence and now you're asked to speak? I started writing at the café after closing, sat at my usual table near the back, sipping cold coffee and staring into space while coworkers cleaned around me. My mind felt heavy, full of stories that never got told. So I began there, not with the app, not with the success, but with the silence. The overlooked child, the quiet student, the daughter who built things without praise, the one who kept going anyway. Because some of us aren't born into applause. Some of us grow through doubt, quietly, patiently, powerfully. And then I wrote about Evelyn, about Bernard, about the hospitals, about building while everyone else slept, about choosing purpose over recognition. It wasn't perfect, but it was true, and it felt like the kind of truth someone needed to hear. A week later, I submitted the speech draft. The dean replied with one word, outstanding. The morning of graduation, I ironed my gown in silence, packed my charger and a printed copy of my speech just in case, wrote a short message to my advisor thanking her, replied to a text from the hospital program director, "We're rooting for you." Then just before leaving my apartment, I opened the family chat. Typed today's commencement. I'll be speaking. You can stream it online. No emoji, no guilt, just a fact. They didn't reply. But that wasn't the story anymore. The story was mine now, and I was ready to tell it. I arrived early, not for photos, not for the fanfare, just for a moment of quiet before everything began. The auditorium was massive ceiling lights, like stars arranged in grid seats, rising in soft arc stage, freshly polished. A place built for moments like this, for pride, for applause, for memory. I hadn't told anyone I was coming early. I didn't want to answer questions, didn't want to rehearse small talk. I just needed space. I found my name printed on the program valedictorian. My breath caught just for a second. Not because I hadn't seen it before, but because holding it in my hands made it real. Years of silence, of doing the work alone, of building without recognition, condensed into a title beneath my name in serif font. A few rows behind me, families were filtering in. Moms balancing bouquets. Dads fumbling with cameras. Younger siblings wearing uncomfortable dress shoes. Laughter rippled in waves. Everywhere I turned, pride hovered in the air like static. I looked down at my gown. I had ironed it twice, practiced the speech 6 times, packed a charger and backup USB. But nothing prepared me for what I saw when I glanced toward the 3rd row. My parents, sitting there, early. My mother wore the same lavender dress she had once reserved for weddings. My father wore a blazer I hadn't seen in years, still stiff at the shoulders. They weren't talking, just looking around quietly. No camera, no sign, no banner with my name. But they came, after everything. After the silence, the messages left. Unread the links, unclicked the launch, unacknowledged. They showed up. I froze. A million thoughts ran through me like static. Why now? What changed? Did someone make them come? Did they understand, or were they here to fulfill a ritual, to claim a seat at a moment they hadn't built with me? I turned away before my emotions could betray me. Because if I let myself feel all of it, disbelief, resentment, longing, I might not make it to the stage. I focused on my breath. In, out. Ground yourself. Time passed. The room filled. I barely registered the names being read. Barely noticed the dean's opening remarks. All I heard was the muffled thud of my heart against my chest, and the voice in my head repeating, "Don't look at them. Don't look for them." But then I heard my name. The MC said it clearly, proudly. Our valedictorian this year represents what it means to build in silence. She created a platform now adopted by hospitals to serve those too often forgotten. A solution coded in the quiet, now echoing in communities across the country. Applause. I rose, my feet felt heavy, but I walked. Each step to the podium was a memory, a night at the café, a bug fixed at 2 a.m. A message sent and ignored, a hospital pilot that nearly failed, a user who remembered to light a candle, a life touched, a moment unseen until now. I reached the stage. The lights were warm on my face. The microphone adjusted to my height. My speech rested inside my sleeve, folded like a promise. I looked out not at them, not yet, but at the sea of caps, gowns, and flickering phones. At classmates I had passed in hallways, never knowing their battles. At professors who had only seen one version of me. Then I looked at the third row. They weren't clapping, just watching, still silent. Not out of disrespect, maybe out of disbelief. Like they didn't fully grasp what they were witnessing. I took a breath, gripped the podium, and told myself, speak now. Not for them, not against them, but for every version of you that kept going when no one else did. I took a breath, not to calm my nerves, but to remember why I was here. The speech was folded in my sleeve, but I didn't reach for it. I had written it so many times in dorm rooms, in cafes, in the silence after shift changes, that it lived in my memory like an old friend. I didn't need to read it, I needed to say it. And I began. 4 years ago, I said I arrived here with a laptop that wheezed every time I opened 2 browser tabs, a part-time job, and a major I wasn't sure my family believed in. There was a soft laugh from the audience, but I also came with something else, something stronger than circumstance. I came with a question. Who takes care of the people no one checks on? The auditorium stilled. I continued, my voice steady. That question followed me through every class, every night shift, every late night spent debugging lines of code that no one would ever see. It wasn't just a technical problem. It was personal. I wasn't trying to build an app. I was trying to build something that mattered. I paused, looked up, not at my parents, not yet. At some point in our lives, I said, every one of us will feel unseen. Maybe it's in a classroom where your hand goes unnoticed, or at a dinner table where your voice fades under the weight of others, or in a hospital where your name is called from a clipboard, but no one looks you in the eyes. The silence in the room thickened, not heavy, just deep. I built code for care, not because I had funding or a team or a roadmap. I built it because I had silence, and in that silence, I found clarity. Now I looked down at the third row. My mother's eyes were glassy. My father's hands were clenched, elbows resting on his knees. Body still, I didn't let my gaze linger, just enough to register that they were hearing me, maybe for the first time. This university taught me many things, I said. How to write efficient code, how to manage memory, how to document functions. But it also taught me how to stay standing when no one shows up. I paused again. Let the words settle. In my second year, I sent a link to something I had built. I sent it to people I loved, and no one replied. At the time, I thought that was the end of the story. I looked out at the crowd, more than just students now, more than staff. They were people, human beings who had once been ignored, underestimated, doubted. But now I realize it was the beginning. I let the next line land softly, because sometimes silence isn't a void. It's a space waiting to be filled with your own voice. There was a shift in the room, like breath being held, like someone remembering something they hadn't let themselves feel in a long time. I used to think being overlooked was a weakness, that not being the favorite meant I didn't deserve to speak. But what I've learned, what I hope you'll take with you, is that being unseen doesn't mean you aren't becoming something powerful. A pause. And then the closing. To everyone who's ever felt like a second draft, a backup plan, a shadow. You are not invisible. You are not an accident. You are not late. You are building something the world doesn't see yet. Keep building it. I let the final words hang in the air. Then softly, thank you. The applause didn't come immediately. It built slow rising wave after wave until it filled the room like a storm breaking open. I stepped back from the podium. People were standing, phones lifted, faces wet. Professors who had never said more than hello clapping like they'd known me all along. And in the third row, my father stood. My mother, too. They didn't wave. They didn't call out. They just stood there quietly clapping. Maybe for me, maybe for the version of me they were only now beginning to see. The applause faded gradually, like waves receding after a storm, leaving the floor glistening and silent. I walked off stage numb, not with cold or nerves, but with a strange, unnameable weight. I had spoken my truth, not dressed it up, not softened it. I had stood before hundreds of people and cracked myself open not to perform, but to finally be real. And now, it was quiet. A staff member gestured for me to exit left. Someone offered me a bottle of water. I took it, nodded, thanked them. My hands shook slightly as I opened the cap. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding my breath for the last 20 minutes. Backstage, there was movement ushers whispering into headsets, administrators checking time slots, a graduate crying quietly near a curtain. But no one looked at me. Not out of rudeness, just reverence, like I'd become untouchable for a moment. I stood in the corner, gripping the podium copy of my speech like a life vest, unsure what to do next. Then my phone buzzed. A text from my advisor: "You didn't give a speech. You gave them something to remember who they are." I smiled. Not wide, just enough to let myself feel it. Messages trickled in one after another. Classmates, a teaching assistant, Evelyn, even Bernard, the 91-year-old from the pilot program. "I cried," he wrote. "Thank you for not forgetting people like me." But there was still one message I hadn't received. From them, I checked the family group chat. Nothing, not a word. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and returned to the hallway where graduates were now streaming out like confetti robes, flapping in the wind mortarboards, askew. Families swarmed them, hugs, flowers, laughter. I stood on the fringe, scanning, until I saw them, my parents, still standing in the same row, as if unsure whether they were allowed to move. My mother was holding her purse in both hands, a tight grip, like she needed to ground herself. My father's jaw was clenched, not in anger, more like restraint. I walked toward them, slowly, carefully, no script now, just space. They saw me, and for a second we all just stood there, three people bound by blood, but broken by misunderstanding, facing each other in borrowed clothing and uncomfortable shoes. Then my mother said the first words. "You memorized it." Her voice cracked on the last syllable. I nodded. I wrote it at the café, after a shift. She looked away, not because she was disinterested, but because she was trying not to cry. My father cleared his throat, rubbed his hands together like he was about to offer business advice, then stopped. He looked me in the eye for the first time in what felt like years. That was not what I expected. I waited. He swallowed hard. But maybe that's because I never really asked what you were building. It wasn't an apology. Not exactly, but it was something. I nodded again. Still, no hugs. No dramatic reunion. Just presence. A raw, hesitant presence that said, "We're here now. We don't know how to do this, but we're trying." A student photographer passed by and asked if I wanted a picture with my family. I hesitated. Then for some reason, I said yes. We stood together, three silhouettes in awkward formation. No arms around shoulders, no big grins, but side by side, on record, click, and that was enough. We parted ways quietly after that. No lunch plans, no, let's catch up soon. Just a mutual nod that maybe this was a beginning, not an ending. Later that night, I returned to my room alone. Hung the gown, removed the pin, placed the speech on my desk. Then I opened the folder on my laptop labeled Proof It Matters. And I added one more file. That night I didn't celebrate. There was no party, no champagne, no dinner reservation. I ordered takeout from the same Thai place I'd used to survive finals week, extra tofu, no spice. At cross-legged on the dorm floor, still in my gown hair, undone eyes sore from blinking too much under stage lights. The room was quiet. Jenna was gone for the weekend, and the building itself felt hushed, as if it too had been holding its breath all afternoon. I stared at the speech on my desk, still folded, still smoothed at the creases where I'd held it too tightly backstage. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The words were part of me now, etched between my ribs, living proof that I'd said what needed to be said. But still, there was no closure. Not really. Not the way I'd once hoped for. No dramatic reckoning with my parents. No long overdue apology. No tearful confession of past mistakes. Just a stiff nod from my father, a fragile sentence from my mother, and a photo that looked more like a ceasefire than a celebration. And yet, something had shifted. It was small, subtle, but real. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was carrying the whole story alone. They had heard me, maybe not understood everything, maybe not changed, but they'd been there, sat in the audience, listened without interrupting, witnessed something they never thought would come from me. And witnessing matters, sometimes more than words. I didn't sleep that night. My body was tired, but my mind buzzed. Not with regret, not even with relief, but with a strange, quiet kind of freedom. Like I had finally taken up space I didn't know I was allowed to claim. At 2:17 a.m., I opened my laptop. Not to check grades, not to respond to the flood of emails piling up from professors and press inquiries. I opened Code for Care. The dashboard showed 224 active users, 4 hospitals, 2 senior centers, 1 pilot site preparing for expansion. I scrolled through the admin panel, watching the logs update in real time. Notifications sent, messages opened, medications confirmed. It was working. Still working. Even while I sat alone in a dorm room, curled up in yesterday's moment, the thing I built was out there moving, connecting, reminding someone to check in, to show up, to care. I clicked into the logs and found Evelyn's name. She'd scheduled a video call for the following Monday. Her granddaughter, according to the notes, would be joining from college. A different college. Another young woman navigating her own life. And somehow my code had created a bridge between them. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Not to sleep, just to breathe. In, out. I no longer needed my parents to name what I had done. I no longer needed their understanding to validate my direction. They were no longer the destination. They were just part of the beginning. And I had arrived somewhere new. The next morning I got a text. From my mother. Just 2 words you spoke. I stared at it for a full minute, then typed back, yes. I did. She didn't reply. And that was okay. Because some acknowledgments don't come wrapped in praise. Sometimes they come as silence that no longer hurts. A week after graduation, I moved out of the dorm quietly. No balloons, no send-off. Just a cardboard box marked Tech, a suitcase missing 1 wheel, and a campus ID that would expire in 2 days. Jenna hugged me briefly, said something about staying in touch. We both knew we probably wouldn't, but it was kind of her to pretend. I took one last look at the room, the dent in the mattress from nights of coding, the windows smudged with late-night condensation. The wall where I'd taped Evelyn's first message. Then I closed the door. Outside, the world was the same. Same streets, same skyline. But something inside me had changed. I was no longer building just to prove I could. I was building because people were waiting. The Monday after I met with the Public Health Foundation that had been following the pilot. They wanted to talk about expansion, real expansion. Regional licenses, funding pathways, partnerships with telehealth companies. I wore the only blazer I owned. Presented a cleaned-up version of the Code for Care pitch now with data testimonials, growth projections. For the first time, I wasn't nervous. Not because I felt sure, but because I felt grounded. What I had built wasn't just a prototype anymore. It was infrastructure. It was a bridge. One of the foundation directors, a woman in her 60s with salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes, leaned back in her chair when I finished. You built this while doing undergrad, I nodded. She whistled softly. What exactly do you want from us? I answered without hesitation. Support, not control. She smiled. Good answer. The meeting ended with a handshake, and an invitation to submit a grant proposal for national rollout. I walked out of the building not with a job offer or a title, but with something more powerful: credibility. That afternoon, I took the long way home, walked past the hospital where Evelyn had first used the app, past the café where I'd written version 1.0, past the bench where I once cried into a cup of vending machine tea after a night shift. Everything was still there, but now it looked different. Not because the world had changed, because I had. Later that week, I got an email from a school district asking if I'd be willing to speak to high school girls about tech, about what it means to build without backing, about what it means to be the quiet one who doesn't quit. I said yes, without even thinking. Because legacy, I was learning, isn't what you leave behind. It's what you give away while you're still becoming. It's the door you keep open, the table you make room at, the voice you raise not to shout over others, but to let them know they're not alone. And Code for Care wasn't just mine anymore. It was theirs. Theirs to use, to improve, to carry forward. A month after graduation, I received a letter in the mail, not an email, not a notification. A real letter creased at the corners, slightly smudged in the upper right from postage ink. It came from a senior living facility in Nebraska. The envelope had my name printed neatly, no return address sticker, just a pen-written line across the top, for the founder of Code for Care. I opened it slowly, unsure what to expect. Inside was a short note. 3 paragraphs, no punctuation errors, no request for tech support. Just a thank you. It was written by a resident named Marla, 84 years old. She said the app had become part of her morning ritual. She said her son, who lived in Texas, checked in with her now without needing a reminder from guilt. She said the reminders didn't just keep her on schedule, they made her feel seen. At the bottom, she wrote, "I'm not afraid to grow old anymore. Not if people like you are designing the world I'll grow into." I folded the letter back into the envelope, held it for a moment, then added it to a box I kept beneath my desk marked "Not Code." That's where I'd started placing things that didn't belong in the app's GitHub repo, things that weren't features bugs or sprint notes. A printed photo of Evelyn's visit log, a sticky note from a volunteer nurse in Ohio, a drawing from a 3rd grader whose grandmother used Code for Care and called it her supervisor app. That box became my real product, because somewhere along the way, I'd realized what I built wasn't just software, it was trust. It was acknowledgement in a world that forgets quietly. And that mattered more than clean code ever could. I still updated the platform, still responded to messages, managed servers, worked on interface improvements. But I no longer saw success in terms of user count or uptime percentages. I saw it in moments, in messages like Marla's, in the way hospital staff began treating the app not as helpful, but as essential. In the shift from "this might be nice" to "we can't imagine not having this." And in the realization that for the first time in my life, I didn't need to fight to be heard. The work was speaking for itself. Sometimes when I had time, I gave talks. Not about coding, about silence, about what it means to build without a crowd. I told audiences the truth that the hardest part wasn't the code. It was showing up day after day with no guarantee anyone would care. It was writing the first line of something you're not sure anyone will ever use. It was pressing send on a message that might never get a reply and doing it anyway. And every time someone would come up to me afterward and say, "I thought I was the only one." That's when I knew what I had built wasn't an app. It was permission for others to do the same, to build slowly, to build quietly, to build with heart even when the room is empty. Especially when the room is empty. Because that's where real things are born. And that's the legacy I want to leave behind. Not just a platform, not just a tool, but a question: who are we when no one is watching and we choose to build anyway? If you're still watching, thank you. Not just for making it to the end, but for staying, for holding space for a story that didn't have headlines or viral moments or grand cinematic victories. A story built in the quiet, one line of code at a time, one message unanswered, One hand still raised even when no one was looking. Maybe you're here because you've been that person too. The second choice. The quiet one. The late bloomer. The invisible thread holding something together without credit, without noise, without applause. If so, I want to tell you something that took me 4 years to learn. You don't need to be loud to matter. You don't need to be chosen to build something that lasts. You don't need an audience to start. You just need to begin. And if you've begun already, if you're building something small in the dark, wondering if it will ever be seen, I want you to know that is the work. That's where all of this begins. Not on stages, but in backrooms. Not with perfect plans, but with stubborn hope. Code for Care was never just about the elderly. It was about remembering anyone who'd been left out of the story. It was about making care a choice, not an afterthought. It was about proving that even in a world obsessed with noise, something quiet can still change lives. Maybe you're not building an app. Maybe you're rebuilding yourself after being broken. Maybe you're helping someone no one thanks. Maybe you're trying to raise a voice that shakes a little when it speaks. Good, let it shake. But don't let it stop. Because the world doesn't just need more tech. It doesn't just need more noise. It needs more people who build from the inside out. People who create because it's right, not because it's profitable. People who choose meaning over marketing. People like you. You watching this screen with your headphones in at the end of a long day, wondering if anything you're doing matters. It does. It matters. Because the truth is, no one knows what the thing that changes everything looks like at the beginning. Most of the time it looks like failure, like struggle, like no one is paying attention. Until one day they are. But by then you won't need their attention, because you'll know what it's worth even without it. So build your thing, write your words, show up, stay late, care too much, because you never know who you're saving by simply refusing to quit. If this story moved, you share it. Not for me. For the person who needs to hear it after you. Because someone out there is one click away from giving up. Let them know they're not alone. Let them know it's okay to build slow. Let them know quiet is not the same as weak. Let them know the world still makes space for the ones who speak gently and change everything. I didn't ask them to clap. I didn't ask for the words they never said. Because my worth was never in their approval. It was in every quiet morning I coded with aching fingers. In every elderly voice I answered when no one else had time. In every line of purpose I wrote when no one was watching. Success didn't come from being helped. It came from building something that helped others. And on that stage, when the room paused, I knew I hadn't just graduated. I had arrived. Not for them, not in spite of them, but because I finally believed I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I didn't do it alone. I did it enough.